Vice President Research and International at the University of Manitoba. Welcome to today's cafe. These cafes are the initiative of my office, and the purpose of these cafes is to bring the amazing researchers closer to the community in a comfortable setting. And we are thankful to McNally Robinson for providing us this space for having this casual conversation about exciting research at the University of Manitoba. We have an exciting topic of discussion for tonight's cafe, the emerging research field of the use of statins beyond cholesterol lowering. I was asking Dr. Halayko, I thought the statins have been around for quite some time. He said it's the beyond cholesterol lowering makes it an emerging field, not the statins themselves. Our research group at the faculty, Max Rady College of Medicine and Rady Faculty of Health Sciences focuses on potential uses of statins in cancer, chronic lung diseases, as well as the known cardiovascular benefits. I would like to now introduce your moderator for this evening, who will tell you more about the panelists and some of the ground rules that will guide the discussion this evening. Dr. Andrew Halayko is a professor in Department of Physiology and Pathophysiology, Internal Medicine and Pediatrics and Child Health at Max Rady College of Medicine, Rady Faculty of Health Sciences, and is scientist at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba. He holds a Canada Research Chair in Airway Cell and Muscle Biology. He is an internationally recognized expert in understanding the biology and biophysics of airway smooth muscle in asthma and other chronic lung diseases. He completed his graduate studies at the University of Manitoba in plant sciences and physiology, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in respiratory and critical care at the University of Chicago before returning home to University of Manitoba as a professor of physiology and internal medicine. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Halayko.
Thank you, Dr. Jai. It's a pleasure to see a great crowd here on a somewhat slippery ride. I have been driving from Oak Bank, so the highways were a little slick at the beginning. So thank you all for coming here tonight, and I do think we can have a very interesting discussion. I'll be your moderator, as Digber has said. You can call me Andrew. So a quick overview of how this is going to go. Each of our panelists will speak with you, or to you, I guess, originally, and then with you for about 5 minutes. Tell you a little bit about what they're doing in their area of focus. Then we open for discussion, and I get to play Phil Donahue and run around with this microphone. And so please put your hands up when you have a question, and I will get to you, hopefully without tripping over my own 2 feet. The evening is being videotaped, so it'll be put up on the website, the U of M Café Scientifique website within the next week at the University of Manitoba. I'll take the last question around 8:25 if we're still going strong at that point. Refreshments and information booklets here on the side that many of you have already seen. Please help yourself at any time during the proceedings. Get up and help yourself. There were evaluation forms on your seats when you sat down, so please do fill them out before you leave, and if you can return them to that table as you head out, that would be greatly appreciated. And then the last thing, as far as ground rules go, remember we're here for general discussion. This is not the forum to ask or to expect answers about personal medical issues and questions. So that's not the intention of our panelists today. So try and keep the discussion at a general level if you can. So I will introduce to you now the 3 panelists who are sitting out of order. But I'll start with the gentleman in the middle. It's Dr. Amir Ravandi. So Amir is a clinical scientist. He's an associate professor of cardiology and physiology, as well as research director of the section of cardiology at the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences here at U of M. He holds the Manitoba Medical Services Foundation Duval Clinical Research Fellowship currently, very prestigious. He's also an interventional cardiologist in his day job, working at St. Boniface Hospital. He's a principal investigator at the Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences at St. Boniface, and his current research focus is identifying the contribution of bioactive lipids to cardiac muscle injury during acute myocardial infarction. On his left is Dr. Saeid Ghavami. Saeid is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Anatomy and Cell Science in the Max Rady College of Medicine, Rady Faculty of Health Sciences. He's a principal investigator with research focusing on developing new therapeutic approaches for lung cancer and for brain cancer. He completed his PhD in Iran in clinical biochemistry at Tarbiyat Madaris University, and he worked as a postdoctoral fellow in Winnipeg. What year did you arrive?
2004 November.
Since November 2004, starting at Cancer Care Manitoba, and then having the dubious distinction of being a postdoctoral fellow with me for a number of years at the Bannatyne campus. And then on my far left, that end, Dr. Christopher Pascoe, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow working with me in my lab at the University of Manitoba. He's investigating approaches to lung-delivered statins as potential add-on therapies for asthma. He'll tell you a little bit about that. He has awards from Research Manitoba as well as National Award from the Canadian Respiratory Research Network for his work. And he's investigating also the role of oxidized lipids, you're getting a theme here, in airways disease. So he completed his PhD at the University of British Columbia before we were able to bring him here to Manitoba, and he used to study airway reactivity and asthma. So now on to the topic. Before I hand off to Dr. Ravandi, who'll start, we're here to talk about statins and what they can do beyond cholesterol and regulation of circulating cholesterol levels. A little bit of background, they're really fascinating compounds. Understanding of the link between cholesterol and cardiovascular disease really started to emerge around 1910 and evolved over the following 60 years to really appreciate the role of cholesterol and low-density lipoprotein in cardiovascular health. Cholesterol was first isolated in 1784, according to my research today, from gallstones. So we've known about it for a long time. And since then, a shocking fact is that 13 Nobel Prizes have been awarded to scientists who've had a major part of their research has been associated with cholesterol biology. Very impressive. That's very important. Back to 1927-28, Drs. Weiland and Windhaus in consecutive years got Nobel Prizes for the proof of cholesterol structure, and then twice since then, once in 1964, Konrad Bloch and Feodor Leinen, who we think was Swedish, based on that name, we're not sure, received Nobel for elucidating the synthesis pathway, and then jumped to 1985 when Michael Brown and Joseph Goldstein worked out the mechanisms regulating that, and that's when statins were born. They didn't discover statins. That was done by Dr. Akira Endo in Japan, and the search for inhibitors of cholesterol synthesis really began in the 70s. He came through in 1976 with what was called compacted. At that time, it was the first statin, and eventually led to pharma companies getting very interested. And in 1987, the FDA approved lovastatin for use in clinical use in the United States. The compactin, interestingly, was isolated. They searched high and low for it, and it was isolated from a blue-green mold from a particular store of rice in Kyoto in Japan, and it was that storage facility that for some reason had the right mold that produced the first statin-like compound. So since then, 6 statins have come to market, at least 6. Today, as you probably know, in 2005, I have data, $25 billion is the pharma market, predicted by 2020 to be well over $900 billion, approaching $1 trillion internationally. The multi-million users, depending where you read, 30 to 50 million users worldwide, depending on the year that you look. So they are used exclusively for cholesterol lowering, but that's not why we're here. Today we're here to talk more broadly about them. So the controversies or some of the interesting discussions about statin use comes in where medical, the medical community started thinking of them as primary prevention. So giving them to healthy people, do they help? Question I think Dr. Ghavami may be able to address, but it's to be answered, I think. He can elucidate you. And what became clear is that statin use was associated with improved health of the lung, associated with aging in smokers. Some of the VA hospitals in the United States, it was very clear that individuals who happened to have been prescribed statins for cardiovascular reasons were doing better with respect to their lung health. So we started to make those links there, and the same story really holds true for a number of cancers. So that's led to some momentum in research, and you'll hear about what's happening at U of M today with respect to developing statins, or at least using what we can learn from why they may be effective in those other diseases to develop new therapies for cancer and for chronic lung disease. So with that background, I'll hand off to Dr. Ghavami. I don't have to hand off, you got a mic. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm sure most of you know somebody who's either under statin or has had issues with cholesterol. By that I mean people have had heart disease. As you know, it's pretty prevalent. I certainly see it a lot during my practice. And we knew for the longest time it's one of the, as Andrew alluded to, it's been one of the majorly studied pathways in the human biology for many years because it impacts a lot of people. Coronary artery disease is the #1 killer in the world. So because of that, there's been immense amount of research and scrutiny of that disease. And I prescribe statin because it's one of the only drugs that actually, one of the drugs that has powerful impact in lessening the morbidity and mortality of heart disease. So as you mentioned, since it's been discovered, we knew that it brings cholesterol down, it improves LDL levels, which is the bad cholesterol, and it improves cardiac outcomes. The good reason that this drug is so impactful is because so many people have been studied on it. Close to upwards of 1 million people have been randomized in these trials. And the more we learn about heart disease, the more we learn about how this drug particularly works, this group of statins, we started to link that it's not just affecting the impact on heart disease, but also inflammation. A lot of the diseases that Andrew talked about, cancer, lung disease, heart disease, they all have a sort of a common theme of inflammation. And as we learn more about statins, we know that it's not just the effect on cholesterol that's impacting patients and how they do, is how it impacts inflammation. And I think that's the part and parcel of the talk today, is to how statins, by the way they work, the classic term of pleiotropic effects, meaning things that are beyond what it does, just lowering cholesterol, how it impacts disease, what type of diseases it impacts. And part of the work that I do is looking at specific molecules that this drug potentially could impact. And we look at lipid molecules that are inflammatory, and looking at how potentially statins can impact the levels in the body, specifically in lung disease. I know that Dr. Pascoe is going to get into that as well. So it's had a long story. It's been around the block almost once. Now we're trying to understand how it actually impacts other diseases because of this umbrella term of inflammation, which is common amongst a lot of diseases. So I know it's very controversial for a lot of areas, but the hard evidence tells us that it does work. We don't know exactly how it works, but it does work. And I think hopefully in the next little while, looking into the details and the mechanisms allows us to pinpoint exactly how it works. And when we find that out, hopefully allows us to not only treat heart disease, but other diseases as well. That was my...
So, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Amir, for explanation about the statin. Actually, I describe a statin from other angle that is a little bit different from what has Amir described. So, to give you an idea about the angle that I am working on it, on the cancer, I introduce an important concept that most living organism always dealing with it. That is the balance between the living and the death. And if this balance changed, for example, we have much more cell death or much more proliferation, then the disease will come. So let's give you an example. This is cancer, for example, that we have a lot of much more proliferation, uncontrolled proliferation that may cause the cancer. There are several things, mechanisms inside the cells that control this balance inside the cells, and because of the restrict controlling mechanism, we call them program controlling. And on the aspect that my research is focused is the this, and this is the program cell death. So for controlling the program cell death, there are many different organelles inside the cells that controlling this. And one of these organelles is the engine of the cells that produce energy for the cells. And this control, one of the major program cell death that has been studied for more than 50 years, and it is called program cell death 1 or apoptosis. As many of you dealing with the recycling and the garbage at home, the living organism also dealing with these things. And the other program mechanism that is inside the cell and responsible for this recycling is called program cell death 2, and drive the recycle and garbage to the furnace of the cells that is called the lysosome. So between the lysosome and the engine of the ATP in the cells, that is mitochondria, there is a very close crosstalk. This close crosstalk regulate the disease mechanism, for example, cancer. So most of you are familiar with the comic and the Marvel heroes. And one of this that you may be familiar is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So you know Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde has two faces, bad face, good face. So one of the things that I am doing in my lab is that controlling the cell death mechanism to use it as a good face to help the patients, to help the people, and derive controlling this balance in this disease, for example, cancer. Now, where statin coming? Actually, around 5 years ago, there was a very important epidemiology report in one of the most prestigious medical journals called New England Journal of Medicine. And they have investigated around 200,000 patients who take a statin. And then this population, they studied the people who got cancer. They found out that the people who got the cancer and used to have used a statin for years has better outcomes in response to cancer therapy. But this is only a correlative study. Few years later, a very important study in brain tumor called glioblastoma has published, and they mentioned that the glioblastoma patients who take simvastatin and then they take the chemotherapy drug for the glioblastoma have longer survival compared to the patient who didn't take a statin. Then I asked this question, what is this mechanism? How can we answer this mechanism, and how possibly we can improve this in benefits of the patients maybe in 20, 30 years future? So I studied this phenomenon that the program cell death 2 that is responsible for recycling the garbage is involved in this mechanism. But in the last, I have this point that the statin and cholesterol are important not only for the cancer cells, but for the normal cells too. So we designed a nanoparticle in collaboration with the chemists, and we are hopeful to target the malignant and cancer cells with nanoparticle, so we are much more effective in future to targeting the cancer cells. So this is my part.
Right, thank you, Dr. Ghavami. Last speaker, Chris Pascoe.
Good evening, everyone. So I do lung research. My PhD was in researching asthma, but now that I've entered Dr. Halayko's lab, come to Winnipeg, I've branched out into more lung disease, COPD, and asthma. Just to give you a bit of background, so COPD, in case you don't know, is typically thought of as a smoker's disease, smoker's lung, but in this day and age, with more people being exposed to pollution, aging, and not just cigarette smoke, it's become the fourth leading cause of death worldwide, and actually third leading cause of death in the US. We don't really have any treatments that can stop the progression of the disease, reverse the progression of the disease, and really the treatments we're using now to control the disease in many patients aren't that effective. So we need better treatments, which is one of the avenues that we're researching in the lab. And the other side of that is asthma, which is typically thought of as a childhood disease, but can affect anybody throughout the age groups. A disease of a progressive airway narrowing, difficulty breathing. And for the most part, in the mild disease and the moderate disease, this is controlled quite well with our current treatments, which are inhaled steroids and inhaled puffers, as we call them, or airway dilators. But in those patients with more severe disease, this control is very poor, and in fact 10% of those patients don't respond at all to those treatments and take up a lot of not just cost when it comes to the healthcare system, but end up missing a lot of work, a lot of school, is the leading cause of hospitalization among children. So we need to understand why that is and design treatments that are effective, perhaps can make our old treatments effective again. And this is where we've started to investigate statins, specifically simvastatin in our lab. There are some retrospective studies and cohort studies on patients who were taking statins for heart disease, and noticed that in those patients, if they had COPD, they visited the hospital less often. They had fewer death from their disease. If it was in somebody with asthma, they took fewer steroids for their disease and needed less oral steroids, which is a more potent way of taking the treatment, but it's also met with a lot of side effects. And those children, or not children, but the adults who were taking statins ended up in the hospital far less often. So the idea was, well, maybe there's something there, maybe this is a treatment we could use in both of those diseases. Unfortunately, some of the clinical trials that have gone on, one in COPD, where they tried to give statins to people who had never taken them before, didn't have heart disease, but had COPD, it was ended after a year because there was no effect. There was no effect on acute exacerbations. They still went to the hospital just as often, and ethically, they stopped the trial. So everybody just kind of called statins quit there. It's not going to have an effect, but we think in our lab, and we had a very, very talented PhD student in our lab who had the idea that, well, maybe it's because you're giving it to the wrong place. If you take statins orally, is it even getting to the lungs, right? The unique thing about targeting diseases in the lungs is we can target it directly. We don't have to take a pill. We can inhale what we need to target it. It's like treating a skin disease. So using some mouse models in our lab, specifically right now focusing on asthma, we've been able to develop a formulation of statins that has a significantly lower dose required to have an effect. We've been able to see that we've been able to resolve many of the features of disease in these mice, these animals. So we're trying to understand why that is. How is it helping when you deliver it to the lungs, but not when you take it orally? And if we can understand how it's having an effect, can we use this as an add-on therapy, if you will, in asthma? Add it to those patients who aren't responding to steroids, see if we can make them responsive again and reduce the amount of time they spend in the hospital.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, guys. There's lots of interesting stuff to think about there and to probe on. So, as I said, we'll open the floor up to you now for your questions. If you can put your hand up, I'll run around with the microphone and get it to you. And I see one already. And if you want to direct it at one person, that's fine. So it's Saeid, Amir, and Chris. And if you want to just ask a general question, that's also fine. Please, I think I saw this hand first.
Was there any relationship between the length of time someone had been on the statin and the response that they got?
Yeah, so we think that was, I mentioned the route of delivery, but one of the reasons that randomized control trial maybe failed is that they were not on it for a long time. So if maybe it slowly builds up in the lungs over time, then you'll see an effect the longer you go out. And certainly people who had been on the statins since they were 40, 45 years old probably had a more beneficial effect of those statins, but I don't think there was a specific outcome in any of the trials. But if I were to think about it, that would be probably the way that it would be having an effect. As I said, if we look back on it, if we look back at these patients 20, 30 years later, it does seem like there are some effects. We're hoping there's a better way to get that effect without having to take it for that long.
Yeah, to that point, what we're seeing definitively in the experiments Chris is doing and others in my lab is that statins really are not very effective at acute effects. So we don't dilate airways if you're having an asthma attack if you suddenly inhale a bunch of statin. There is a sort of a resetting of the equilibrium of the membranes and the lipids in the cells that's required. So some prolonged use of statin we think is necessary for the full effect to be noted. In some of the early trials for asthma, statin and clinical trials, small numbers of people, poorly designed, people who were pretty well controlled anyway, so I don't know how they thought they'd look better by putting them on a statin, were 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 2, and so we think that we're flawed, and they were all negative results for the most part. So there is a duration. I think you saw this gentleman here.
What's inflammation?
What's inflammation? So inflammation, I guess we'll tackle this. I'll start. When we think about it in the airways, it's what makes the airways swell up. It's what helps or promotes narrowing of the airways. It's released by your white blood cells. It causes other white blood cells to come in. It can cause tissue damage. If you think about, say you sprain your ankle and it swells up, that's caused by inflammation in part. Which promotes healing in many instances, and it's not a bad thing. I think you should put that out there, that inflammation itself is not bad. If you didn't have inflammation, then any bacterial or viral infection you would have would not end very well. So you need inflammation, but the problem in chronic disease like asthma and heart disease and cancer is that the inflammation continues and it's unresolved and it never stops. And so inflammation at its heart is a response to damage or an intruder, if you will, but it does damage the tissues.
Yeah, so I think I second that. Inflammation is what we describe as too much of a good thing. You do need it, but if it becomes prolonged and it becomes chronic, that's when the damage occurs. And it's not a healing thing, it becomes a damaging thing. So you do absolutely need it to take care of lots of things in our body, to know when there's injury, know when there's an attack. But if it becomes prolonged, then it becomes damaging, especially for your lungs. If you have a foreign body in your lung, you can easily expel it. You do have a bit of inflammation. But the disease process starts when that thing becomes prolonged. What triggers it? Why does it last longer? Is it something for the body, or the allergen? So that's where the million-dollar question is. And inflammation is a multifaceted thing that in every organ and every disease, it presents itself a little bit differently. And it's a very complex set of things that occur, but still, it is a common umbrella amongst a lot of other diseases.
The other thing to think about with inflammation is it can be local. Think mosquito bites, little red welt. That's inflammation at that spot in the skin. We're also talking about systemic inflammation, so you can measure in the blood markers of inflammation, so-called cytokines or C-reactive protein you may have heard about. Sometimes visit your doctor will say you include that in your exam, your blood tests rather. So it can be systemic, it can be local. Local generally I think is good. It's fighting an invasion at that site. Inflammation is also associated with cancer. generally we try and fight tumors, and tumors are very smart at overcoming that inflammation. So you can have excess inflammation there that's actually doing nothing. So inflammation can be our friend, as Amir said, but also our foe if it's not controlled, ma'am.
I think this question is for Amir. I know a number of people who take who take statins for cholesterol issues, and they tell me they have a lot of side effects with muscles, muscular wasting, in some cases outright pain. And I wondered if that happens with all the cholesterol pills, or is this very common? What do you do about it?
Yeah, that's a very common question that people ask, and is always constantly a worry for some people. There's lots of different cholesterol or statin drugs out there. And for some people, some of them are tolerated really well. Could be potentially the dose that they're taking, or it could be, for instance, a atorvastatin versus rosuvastatin versus pravastatin. So those complications are there. They're rare, but if you look at it overall, it's not a common type of thing that we see. But if it's there, we usually either change the dose, change to another class, I should say another drug, and hopefully come up with the one that doesn't cause as much side effects for them.
Okay, this isn't my issue, I don't take them, but friends, pretty well all the friends I have do have muscular problems.
Mm-hmm.
So if they say that to me, I should ask them to ask their doctor for a different class of drugs.
Potentially.
Okay.
If I just chime in there, one other thing when we start to think about statins and other types of diseases like lung disease or cancer, in our lab, in the models we're using, we've been able to see an effect of statins on our disease, but with a much reduced dose. So if you think about the dose somebody would be taking is in a pill for cholesterol, the effect we see in the lungs, you only need 1/7,000th of that to see the effect. So the idea would be, you know, if those side effects are a problem, then hopefully we can mitigate those in the lung by targeting it to the lung at a much lower dose, because dose really has an effect on those.
One thing I've got two questions here. One thing I'll just to point out is targeting therapy is really important. So Saeid told you about nanoparticles he's working on that would target tumors and deliver statin directly to them. So therefore mitigating sort of the systemic effects of getting high doses of a statin to do the job that he's looking for. And as Chris has already said, delivering to the lung is fortuitous, because we can reduce the dose and get just what we need there, and it doesn't go systemic. Sir?
Saeid, you talked about increasing apoptosis in the cell. What I'm really interested in is because of the stuff, like the people who had them and then stopped, do you think there might be an epigenetic effect at work causing that?
Actually, this is a very good question, and there could be some epigenetic effect, because statin, as I mentioned, one of the major target of statin is mitochondria and cellular metabolism. And there is a direct link between the metabolism and the regulation of epigenetic. So it could have some epigenetic effect. But regarding, I wanted at that time to answer one thing, is about the effect of statin on the muscles. That recently we have investigated the effect of statin on a cancer that is called rhabdomyosarcoma, and it is the muscle cancer. And what we have found that is very interesting and could be the mechanism that statin can target the normal muscle is that there is a difference between the normal muscle and cancer muscles. And the difference is that the program cell death 2 that I mentioned, and we strongly believe that in the normal muscle, the program cell death 2, which is autophagy, is extremely active because of the number of the mitochondria. And what will happen when the people take the statin, it could affect this muscle, and we could have the loss of the muscle in the long time. So hopefully in next few years we could address this question by this mechanism too.
Switching the train of thought here, disease like ulcerative colitis and colitis, has any research been done to link statins reducing inflammation?
I don't know any off the top of my head, that's not my area, but I would assume based on what we've seen in the lung and what we've read about the way statins work, that one of the pleiotropic effects that I think Andrew was alluding to in his introduction is that statins reduce inflammation, and we think they do that by turning down kind of cellular signals to each other. So if taken for a long enough time or targeted to the right place, any disease where inflammation is at the heart of the problem could potentially see a benefit from statins, but I don't know any literature off the top of my head.
I can point out for the colitis, and there are several reports about the very chronic and severe colitis that could end to the colorectal cancer and GI cancer. There are several reports that the people who take the statin in the end stage, it has a positive effect and reduce the rate of incidence of the GI cancer. So it could be some answer to your questions.
Thank you.
Andrew's getting a good workout.
Have you looked at the effect of statins on the brain? I was reading a few papers that refer to memory blackout due to the statins and a possible initiation of Alzheimer. This was referred mainly after heart attacks, treatment after heart attacks. Did you see anything on this?
So there is some reports, as you mentioned, the people who've been part of clinical trials, as they report all their symptoms, there was a potential increase in memory loss or potential memory effects. But when they did the meta-analysis and putting the entire larger group of people together, that signal wasn't as strong. So we're not as worried about it. There was, I think, a couple of trials that there was a spike in increase. It was potentially statistically significant. But if when they put larger groups of trials together with larger numbers of patients taking these drugs, that signal wasn't as significant. So.
And I think again, getting back to this whole dosing thing, I think it kind of speaks to a need in our research area, and all research areas, just to, if you can target your treatment to where you want it to go, whether it's cancer, lung disease, heart disease, ulcerative colitis or whatnot, by doing a targeted effect, you can reduce the dose, possibly you can also reduce a lot of those side effects, because you're no longer having to hope that it gets to where you want it to be.
Question in the back. One of the other things I note about the side effects of statins that you see appear, they're very often similar to aging-associated decline, shall I say. And so it's sometimes hard to, when you think about the people who are on these drugs, that may be something that's happening anyway. Now, that's not to be cavalier about potential side effects. All drugs do. This one certainly does have wide-ranging effects that we don't fully appreciate, which from a biological perspective we're trying to exploit to understand how to better treat certain diseases. So these kinds of questions do come up, and one of the, as the lady mentioned, memory loss, etc., is something that does come up. And again, statin tolerance and appropriate dosing with your physician is important. I thought I saw someone here first and then over here.
I'm not clear on whether the surprise benefits of statins are strictly research now, or are they being used on real patients quite frequently now? And the other question I had was, the whole idea of inflammation is everywhere, and you were saying that the statins can help to reduce that. Are there good tests for, I don't know, people to take to determine whether they do have an excessive amount of inflammation and whether they should be on statins?
So that's the million-dollar question, to see how do you measure inflammation. There's lots of different tests out there. To answer your second question first, so I think Andrew sort of mentioned there's a protein called CRP, C-reactive protein, that people have used actually to decide which patients are actually worthwhile to take statins. So one of the biggest trials that sort of shed light on statins, and not just purely as a cholesterol drug, was a Jupiter trial that he took random patients who have not had any history of heart disease. The only thing they measured was this CRP. And they found that if it's above a certain level, let's start these people on statins without any history of heart disease. Your cholesterol is okay. And they followed them for about 5 years, and they found that in patients who took them, they actually had better outcomes related to heart disease. So there was something different outside of the cholesterol story that trial, which was a very well recognized trial, that told us that yes, something's going on. So your first question was?
Whether this is mainly research rather than...
So as far as I can tell, it's not part of clinical practice to prescribe statins based on other things. The biggest clinical impact still, as part of guidelines in clinical practice, is still with heart disease. Both primary prevention, people who think you have high risk of heart disease but haven't had a heart attack, and also the people who've had heart attack and we know they have heart disease. So those are the two main populations that are statins are still prescribed and Health Canada approved to be given. Everything else is still in the investigational phase.
Saeid, statins and cancer, any trials that you're aware of?
Yes, there is two major trials that is ongoing for the cancer. The first is in phase 2 clinical trial. It is happening in Saudi Arabia, and it is about the statin and glioblastoma, and it passed phase 1. And the other is the clinical trial phase 1 that is ongoing in Iran actually. It is on 50,000 population that high risk on the esophagus cancer in north of Iran. And the first result of this trial will be published in August 2018.
Okay. One of the other things that sort of reaching trial status in cancers are testing so-called prenyltransferase inhibitors. Now, what does that mean? So cholesterol, many steps from start to finish. When you use a statin, you actually inhibit that whole pathway right at the top. So everything between that starting molecule and the end product is also depleted and reduced. Halfway along there are little lipid chains, fatty chains that are needed by other proteins for them to work in the cell. So that, in my opinion, that is the fluke positive effect of statin. That by reducing those, we have this indirect effect on these other proteins. Those proteins are targeted by a group of enzymes that use the lipid chains. They're called prenyltransferases or PTs. So the inhibitors for those are now in trial for some cancers. So that's a direct result of understanding the biology of cholesterol and how statins may or may not work. So there are some spin-offs to this understanding, which is really where I know Saeid and Chris's work is going in terms of understanding how the heck, when you puff statins into a mouse with asthma, do you cure it? Because he can cure asthma in a mouse, as we can create it. So we need to know how, because it doesn't intuitively make sense. There's no obvious reason why. So understanding the biology, the mechanism, I think is going to be the key. So we're not, I think Sydney here is saying that statins will be prescribed by your doctor to treat asthma, but some derivation, some drug or some intervention that derives from the understanding of why it's working at this level will ultimately make it to the clinic. Now I have two hands here, there.
Long ago, many doctors started prescribing ASA as a prevention strategy for healthy heart. And I don't know whether many doctors are still doing that. Some are, some aren't. But when you mention the word inflammation, I think it was well known that ASA was a good response to inflammation. Now, of all your trials of using statin, do you take out the ASA factor? Would you not use people on ASA?
So most of the trials that were done in patients who've had heart disease, and since aspirin was sort of ahead of statins, most of these patients who were randomized, they were exactly the same. So everybody had the equal amount of aspirin use. So the only difference was the statin, not the aspirin use.
But they were still on the ASA.
Yes. Statins is on top of aspirin. They work kind of a little bit differently. Aspirin works on platelets, statins work on LDL and cholesterol, so they work in different pathways in terms of how they affect heart disease.
And I think if we go back to the question about what is inflammation, inflammation is one word, but there's thousands upon maybe even millions of things that contribute to inflammation. So you can have different types of inflammation, you can have different sources of inflammation. Some of them are driven by proteins, some are being driven by fats and HDL and LDL, platelets, white blood cells, epithelial cells, endothelial cells. It's a very small word for a very broad category of things. So you can affect one part of inflammation and still have inflammation. So it's, statins and ASA might work together, targeting different pathways within inflammation, targeting different parts of it to have a better effect.
There was another question here. Thank you.
I'm just curious as to whether or not interventional cardiologist is is it a new specialty or a new, I only heard this recently, like in the last 6 months.
So this is actually a fantastic question because this is the 40th anniversary of the first human angioplasty. So Dr. Andreas Gronsing, back in the late 70s, was the first person. He was a Belgian cardiologist making little balloons inside his house and figured out, you know what, if there's a cholesterol blockage inside the artery, how can I open it up? And then did the first angioplasty. This was 40 years ago. And so the whole field of interventional cardiology, or the heart doctors who put balloons and catheters and stents to open up arteries and prevent lack of oxygen to the heart muscle, and the patients who have chest pain, or people who have actually having heart attacks that the arteries are completely blocked. So that whole field is called interventional cardiology, and it's been one of the biggest, I should say, impact in terms of acute mortality from heart attacks. That now we can quickly open up an artery, prevent it from causing damage to the heart, and hopefully let you survive. And that's the next step, is that's where the statins come in, hopefully keep you from having your next heart attack. So interventional cardiology is a fairly new field. It was, I guess, in the past 40 years. And
so it's separate from a cardiac surgeon then?
Yes, so cardiac surgery is another way of bypassing the blockage. And they figured out, instead of opening your chest and putting bypasses into the heart and around where the blockage is, we can actually use your own arteries as highways to go in and put balloons and stents and open up and push that blockage to the side. So this made a big impact. That's why a lot less people need surgery.
My experience is that the interventional cardiologist is a much more pleasant and gentle person than
You could have a little nick on your wrist, or you can have a nice zipper on your chest.
If you want to interact with one, pick the interventional guy.
So what exactly is a statin? Is it an acid, an organic molecule, an antibiotic, mineral-based? We talked about them, I'm just kind of curious what they actually are.
Go ahead.
So actually, the statin first extracted from the nature, and the active statin is usually a closed cyclic structure, and when it is going to be activated, then it should be opened, and these two forms of statin, the active and non-active one, are always in the equilibrium of each other. But we have different types of statin. The statin that are easily dissolved in the water, that hydrophilic, and the statin that are easily dissolved in the lipid or hydrophilic, so lipophilic. So these two types of statin has some similar effects, but based on the solubility on the water or lipid, their time of effect and the duration of effect are different. And the last thing is that statin has different metabolism rate in the body. So the dosage of statin is completely based on their metabolism in the body.
Amir knows the chemical structure. He could draw it for you.
I'm sure everybody's excited about that.
Yeah. But it's a carbon ring structure with some arms on it, and they actually look like the substrate that the first enzyme in that cholesterol synthesis pathway uses. Like, so the natural compound that would be the starting building block for cholesterol, which is called acetyl-CoA, they look like that. So you fool that enzyme and it grabs onto the statin and it doesn't go any farther. It stops it from doing its thing. So, more questions? Great. I think you had your hand up previously, and I walked right by you. I'm sorry.
What I'm interested in is heart disease and inflammation plays a role in that. And as people age, they often have like arthritis and things like that. So I'm wondering, is there any relationship between, you know, arthritis and the statins and the heart disease? And what could we do then in terms of prevention? Primary prevention I'm talking about.
So there's lots of, if you can think about inflammation as Chris was talking about, that it can attack different organs differently. It doesn't mean that if you have inflammation of your joints necessarily, you're going to have inflammation of your heart arteries or potentially increasing cholesterol buildup in them. But it does sometimes occur together. And again, falls under that big umbrella of inflammation. And how do you reduce it? Again, that is another $1 million question. How can you do something just to have, you can imagine that if there's you need a campfire to keep warm. But if you pour completely cold water on it and completely shut it down, then you're not going to have any heat. So we can give you really aggressive drugs that shuts down your inflammation completely, but then you need it to do other things. So that's very difficult to decide what medications will allow. There's lots out there they're looking at, but nothing that will say, you know what, we're going to bring your inflammation to a point that it's perfectly balanced.
But it would seem to me, in view of like such an aging population and the need to avoid curative treatment as much as possible through prevention, that there should be some studies going on about the role of statins and heart disease and diseases like arthritis, which are common among older people.
If I could speak from the lung point of view, I know there's a body of literature, and not even, if you just look at patients who have, say, COPD, they often have heart disease, or if they have heart disease, they often have COPD. They're comorbid conditions. And there are some research studies in basic science and labs and clinical trials trying to look at if you can treat the heart disease, does the COPD get better? Which is some of those retrospective studies I was talking about, where people on statins for a long time, they find that they're in the hospital less often for COPD. There's reduced mortality overall for that disease. So the question is there a spillover effect? Because the heart and the lung are very closely tied together. In fact, you could almost think of them as one organ, right? Because everything the heart pumps out goes right to the lungs, and everything the lung puts back in goes right to the heart. So there is some retrospective evidence that, at least in lung disease, if you can treat the heart disease or control the heart disease, that you might have a beneficial effect on the lung. So whether that ties over to other organs within the body, I can't speak to that, but for the heart and the lung, it does look like they're quite intimately linked.
But in other words, nobody's interested right now.
Well,
Not in this panel.
But actually, where some of the controversy about the very high prescription rates for statin comes in is because physicians have moved to a primary prevention approach. So statins are often being prescribed So I had a father who had a heart attack at 48. His brother, my uncle, died of a heart attack at 49. So guess what happened when I turned 40? My cholesterol was just, within normal range. Andrew, do you want to start on a statin? Right? So, Amir, what's actually the evidence that taking them for preventative measures works? Because I think that's where the controversy lies. I don't think we really know, do we?
Again,
Yet there's billions of dollars being prescribed. I'm not saying they don't work, we just don't know for sure.
So us, hopefully most the communities, they're scientists, they're very critical of every single piece of evidence, and then almost like a daily basis you go through it and make sure it's best represents or closer to a reality as possible. So I don't know if some of you have heard, maybe over the past couple of years, the way that at least in the US guidelines, how they describe patients or candidate for statins has changed. They've going more based on a risk model as opposed to what your cholesterol is. They figured out if you have a high risk, it doesn't really matter what your cholesterol is, you need to be on a statin. So there's been a shift and caused a lot of confusion for a lot of people. And then belies where the controversy and then how you decide which patient is actually for primary prevention, meaning you haven't had a heart attack yet, but your risk of having one is kind of high. And not just whether your LDL is a certain amount. We come up with a whole risk profile.
Yeah. So the controversy is we don't know that they do bad things, but there isn't irrefutable evidence that they really, really help them. So that's where you as the consumer get to make the choice. And it gets interesting, the discussion. Yeah.
But are you saying, though, that there's no research, I talk about research, of the relationship of statins on things like, because it's so prevalent, the arthritis.
Oh, arthritis and statin?
Yeah.
I'm sure there.
I don't know of, but
The problem with a lot of those, if you look in clinical research, is because there are so many people on statins, it's hard to tease out the effect of a statin and any disease. You're going to have to find people who aren't on statins, who are about the similar age, who may or may not have, say, arthritis or something else, or osteoporosis or any disease. So it's difficult to tease out, but I can't speak to it because my focus is on the lung, but I would not be surprised if you searched in PubMed and you searched literature for statins and arthritis or statins or any your disease of choice, that there has been a retrospective study or some kind of study on that. Whether that's actively happening, there's a lot of research going on, not just at the U of M, but around the world on it, so I wouldn't be surprised.
If there isn't a definitive study, an ambitious graduate student can find the databases and actually go in and say, this database of individuals I have from a different study that was done for a different reason, what was the risk or the prevalence of arthritis? We had a question about colitis earlier. So there's never been a trial to look at it, but you can start getting those retrospective analyses that suggest maybe there's something there and we should. So that's probably where that level of knowledge lies, and none of us are aware of that particular piece of data, but it might be out there. It wouldn't be hard to find it though from existing databases. So these two young ladies waiting. This lady?
First of all, thank you. I'm a statin user and I went through the lipid clinic research just because my GP said I needed to take a statin and I said, no, I'm not. So that put me on a research path. Where does one find good information on the different kinds of statins and the dosage? Because it's got to exist, and we're all learned people, and GPs are only as good as their current stuff they're doing, and media is just unbelievable in advertising. I worry about drug companies and what they're doing.
Well, I think the best person, as you already alluded to, is a lipid clinic. Those are the experts. They probably know more information about every single statin out there and their side effects and their benefits, and so that would be the best resource. If you go to the web, it's very difficult to, throughout the mirage of information that comes at you, which source should I believe, what is what. So that's where sometimes internet can potentially be not a great source of information unless you're very meticulous in terms of figuring out if this source is actually validated or not. So I would still rely on the lipid clinic. Those are probably the best people who know more about statins than anyone and give you the right information.
Yeah. Thank you.
When you mentioned that people are not automatically put on medicines as they once were, or the statins for that matter, it depends on your risk analysis. Are you referring to the Framingham heart
There's a Framingham risk score, there's the ACC-AHA risk score as well, so there's a multitude of risk scores, and I think 2 of them are the most common ones used, and those are the ones that we use to decide what is your risk of having a heart attack in the next 10 years.
Great. He's closer to me.
Well, statins have been around for a while, and my recollection was when they first started being prescribed, there was a concern about them interfering with lipid metabolism in the liver and long-term effects. Can you comment on that at all? Has it changed with the increased use of statins?
We monitor whenever we start a new prescription of statins for people, make sure your liver doesn't react badly, make sure everything else is doing okay. And since those side effects are quite rare, but we still look for them. So it doesn't stop people from prescribing statins, but we monitor for it.
Hi. Thank you for this. My GP had recommended that I go on rosuvastatin, and I was reluctant because I was never on any kind of anything. And she says, oh, it's precautionary, and everybody is taking it. So I questioned that, but I started to take it anyway, and within a week I had had a migraine, and I don't get a headache at all, ever. And I had a migraine for 24 hours from the minute I started taking it, heart palpitations, hot flashes, and I called the office and said, this is not normal for me. Are you sure that I should be on this drug? And she said, well, instead of the 5 milligram, maybe take 10. And I said, no. If I get this many side effects on 5, I won't double it. So she said, whatever you do, don't just stop it. So I had a trip I work out of town sometimes, and I was in New York, and I got back from there by one day, and all of a sudden my right wrist blew up where when I went to emergency they thought it was broken. So they said, are you on anything? And I said, I don't really take anything. I take the odd vitamin and I eat well. And they said, no medication? I said, well, I started this statin drug. And he said, stop it today. He said, have you noticed anything on it? And I said, migraines, and I don't even know what a migraine is. I just know what I had felt like one. And still was hot flashes and heart palpitations, and he said, stop taking this now. And then they casted my wrist, and within probably 6 hours, my fingers went black because my wrist was still swelling. The next day, they took the cast off, and the second wrist went. And then my knees, my elbows, my jaw, my shoulders, and it triggered rheumatoid arthritis. And now I'm on just about everything you can imagine. I'm on a biologic, I'm on prednisone 50 mil, I'm on methotrexate, and I have not, today I am great, so every day I am great, I am grateful, but I would say that if someone recommends a statin drug and you've got side effects, go right past your doctor and say, I'm not taking this anymore. Because if you don't, you could end up like me, and I hope not. Anyway, I don't know what the percentage of people that take statins have an adverse effect, but it couldn't be reversed, and I have never seen the likes of the drugs that I have to take now. So just be cautious. Not everybody needs it, or not everybody should take it. So I would just say, err with a grain of caution.
Well, these stories are always worth listening to and keeping in mind. Drug intolerance is not something that we are unfamiliar with. Statin intolerance certainly occurs. Whether, who knows? It's a one-off study. These are quite well tolerated drugs in general. Any drug could have an adverse reaction. You just never know. So it's not a great story to hear, but I don't know that it's a damnation of statins per se. It seems like a bad series of events that certainly are worth keeping in mind. The advice you give that anyone being put on a drug by a physician should be paying attention to how they feel after they take it, regardless of what that medication might be. So,
You want to take that, Saeid?
Did you have an explanation? No. Are there more questions? Yes, over there.
As a researcher, just my question about that statin, when you do clinical studies in the lab, do you study a specific statin, like atorvastatin or rovastatin? Is there one more effective in your current study more than other? This is the first question. The second one is about that when you do clinical study, you use that statin or that specific ingredient by itself as a monotherapy or in combination with other ingredients? Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I'll start. If I speak to our preclinical work we do in our lab and our work with cells and patient samples, our primary focus has been on simvastatin. It's off patent. We, as a research lab with grant money that's never enough, can get it for relatively inexpensive. But that's been our primary focus right now. If this were to go to clinical trials and eventually get to patient use, we probably need to see if the effect is broadly across statins or specific to one. In our studies, we're always comparing the use of statin to asthma, currently used therapies, which is things like fluticasone or other corticosteroids. But the idea going forward is that this wouldn't be a replacement necessarily for current therapies. It would be an add-on therapy for those people who don't respond to the current therapies. With an idea that if we can bring them under control, they'll need less oral steroids. Speaking of prednisone, which is a common one and has very troubling side effects for some people in the clinic. The use of biologics for asthma, which are not only require injections, but they're also very expensive. And we're lucky here in Canada that that's covered, but not so lucky if you're down south sometimes. So the idea with these statins in asthma would be not to replace therapies, but to modulate current ones.
Saeid, did you want to talk?
Yes, for my research in the cancer, I have used statin in glioblastoma and non-small cell lung cancer. So for glioblastoma, actually, we use the simvastatin. And the reason that we have used simvastatin is that because this statin has the highest permeability to the blood-brain barrier. That is one of the major issues for the brain tumors. And as Chris mentioned, we don't use statin as a therapy. It's actually as an adjuvant therapy to sensitize the cancer cells for the other chemotherapy agents. As an example, for brain tumor, we use temozolomide, and first we sensitize the cells and then use the statins. For the lung cancer, I use a statin and simvastatin in the presence of the cisplatin. So anything that we use is sensitizing the cells and then target them with the chemotherapy agents. Combination.
And just to clarify, when Saeid says when he's studying glioblastoma, he's talking about cancer cells growing in a culture dish. Not people.
I have one more question. I'm not sure to whom to direct it, but I've heard that the long-term effect of statins has not been studied on people over 65. Is that true?
No, there are some smaller trials on the patients who are older, but as you said, the large trials, the ones that put these drugs on the market, were up to 65, but there are some smaller trials showing that even the higher age bracket there is some benefit.
So we've got people studying statin biology, different disease states. So I'm going to get you gentlemen to just talk about that drug discovery process. Where might your work go? What has to happen in the next 5 years for the research you're doing now to have some impact? And do you think there may be a trial in the future based on the work you're doing now? Get a sense of the stage of the research. So who wants to go first?
So, based on the glioblastoma model, as Andrew mentioned, this study we use the cell line, and in the next step that currently we are doing is we have also used the glioblastoma cells from the patients that we call primary glioblastoma cells. At present, my lab is using animal model, and we are going to use this combination in the animal model of the glioblastoma. And in parallel, as I mentioned, we have produced very specific nanoparticle that we believe it delivers the statin specifically to glioblastoma cells, and we are planning to use it in next, for example, 2 years in our animal model. So I am hopeful that this combination could give us enough results and enough data that we can move forward for the next steps. But the next steps for sure won't be a clinical trial in human, because there are huge differences between animal model and the human models because of the immune system and different genetic differences. So for sure, before going to the real trial in human, many things should have been answered. Although there is already a clinical trial in Saudi Arabia, they already started using statin and temozolomide in glioblastoma, but I believe still many things should be done for the movement of our study to real human patients and samples.
That's always a tough question to answer because we always get excited about our research findings in the lab, but to actually make it to a clinically utilized therapy or a drug is a very long road, especially for the field that I'm in terms of heart disease, because we have such great medications out there that in order to beat what's actually out there, you have to have a drug that is an amazing miracle drug. So, but that doesn't stop us from coming up new ways of doing something. So what I work at or look at is patients who come in with heart attacks. When I open up their arteries, the disease doesn't stop right there. They're still at the risk of having something bad happen in the next 24 to 48 hours. The artery's open, blood's going in, heart muscle is still potentially angry. Now that I've opened it up, what can we do to help some of that heart muscle not die? And then we've coming up with looking at lipids and measuring them and figuring out how these lipids potentially can be impacted during that 24 to 48 hours after somebody comes in with a heart attack. And do we have a compound potentially that can inhibit these lipid molecules or fat molecules that are killing your heart cells? And we're in the animal stage of the experiment, and we have some interesting results. Hopefully, if this becomes fruitful enough, we can do large animal studies, and then the next step is actually doing small human trials, a small number of human trials. So those are the steps that something needs to take to get to that point, and that usually takes at least 5, 10 sometimes, depending on how successful something is, 10 years, 20 years.
That you're targeting your first human trial, because to study a healthy age population, and then the drug is out in the market when your main population is started maybe after 60 years old. Is the human trial target the right age group, or you do in the prime of a human being and you apply to the falling apart?
So we look at the patient who has the disease. Usually trials are anybody above the age of 18, so they can consent to be part of a trial. And if you have the disease, it doesn't really matter what age, that's not a big factor. The big factor is whether you have heart disease, whether you have glioblastoma, whether you have asthma. And if you fit that initial disease, then you can get randomized to one of these therapies, hopefully as part of the trial.
Speaking to that point, if you take a look at COPD clinical trials, most of the patients enrolled in COPD clinical trials are 50, 60 plus, simply because that's when the disease is setting in. You wouldn't try a COPD therapy on somebody who's 30 years old, unless they have COPD, but that's pretty rare.
The question I note comes back to the hope that we talk about, and this sort of comes through with statins, is you're asking again kind of about a primary prevention approach for these drugs, right? And so you can see the allure to have physicians prescribe them as such. So what you're really asking is, take them before you're sick. Will I not get sick? But if you think about that, how do you do that study, right? You don't know in 20 years if someone will be sick. So if you start them now, it's not easy to answer that question. And that's partly why the hard evidence as to whether primary prevention is effective with statins works and is worth doing. But you're touching on what we'd love to know, and is there potential there for this kind of an intervention? I want to get Chris to answer about his research, and I want to just point very quickly one thing out about the collision of cardiology and respirology that's really exciting in Winnipeg, and then I think we're getting close to the end. Chris?
So I was going to say, to answer Andrew's question, other than money, which is always needed in research, obviously the other two speakers up here alluded to it, we need to replicate our results in other models of our disease of interest. So for example, asthma, mice don't really get asthma. We can make them have something that looks like asthma, we can fix it, but whether that's going to fix somebody with asthma, we don't know, and we can't just go test that on patients with asthma. That's not ethical, it's difficult. So we have all these models, we need to replicate our studies in multiple models. If I speak to our lab in particular, what we are interested in is developing therapeutics by understanding what's happening at the disease level as far as the cells and the tissues go. So you could design an animal model and give any kind of drug you would think to the lung and see if it has an effect, and you might just roll the dice and it may not. But if we can understand what's happening at the cell level, within the airways, within the lungs, then we can develop therapies that target what's going wrong. So in terms of statins, one of the things that we're doing is we've shown in mice that this helps people, mice with asthma, or what looks like asthma. So why? What's happening in those lungs? What is the statin? What are the statins doing in the lungs? And how can we use the information from that to maybe develop therapies that are more specific than a statin? Andrew alluded to the statins block kind of at the top, and there's all these things that happen downstream. Well, if we can figure out which of those 100 things downstream is important in asthma, let's target just that one, right? And maybe we reduce side effects, maybe we increase specificity. So for statins in lung disease, we obviously need to do more animal models for asthma and for COPD. We need to develop an inhaled formulation of this drug, because we're not there yet. We can mimic it in the lab, but it's not at the stage at all where you could give it to a person. But if we could develop that inhaled formulation and convince pharmaceutical companies or government agencies that the reason their prior statin trials failed is because you were giving it to the wrong place, then we can start up clinical trials where we try giving statins in the lungs with current therapies, as somebody had mentioned over there, that does this reduce exacerbations? Does this reduce the need for other medications? Does this help long term?
I think that I would be optimistic, if not us. I think a trial with inhaled statin for an obstructive airways disease will have been completed or conducted within the next 5 years.
Yeah.
We're that close to try it. Who knows if it'll work? That's why we do these things. Just wanted to point out one thing that may not have been obvious. So Dr. Ghavami studies lipids that get changed in stressful situations like a heart attack. It turns out that those same lipids appear in the lung during an asthma attack, and only through interaction of him and his unique facilities, and my group were we able to move ahead there. So it's a really nice example of the collegiality and where expertise at the University of Manitoba doesn't collide, but actually has some synergy, and we have a number of great studies together working as a group. So it's really been a great example of experts, dare I say, coming together, or at least interested parties coming together. We're very close to closing down. I think we have time for one more burning. Is this the burning one? Okay. Make it good.
It's not really a question, but I wanted to thank all of you for the work you're doing, because it's going to benefit, if not those of us in the room, perhaps our children or our grandchildren. I have one concern, and that is Big Pharma. And Chris alluded to using a generic version of a statin because it's cheaper in the research context. Well, I take a statin and it's cheaper for me too. And if Big Pharma finds out, as they probably will, that you guys are working on all of this, can they renew patents and we're going to be back to paying huge prices for our medications?
The patents have already run out, luckily.
Well, yes, but can they not renew them for a different use?
Well, it's hard. It's hard because if I speak to our lab, if we wanted to patent statins for the use in asthma, you can't do that. That's not patentable. And we've run into that problem.
All right. So what I'll maybe have the closing comments, unless any of you want. Thank you all for coming out here, and as a blue-collar raised Winnipeg, born and raised Winnipeg boy who watched my mom and dad work pretty hard and pay their taxes and recognize that our research is funded in large part through the citizens of Canada and the money we get. It's really an honor, and I'm not saying that to be flippant, it's really an honor to be here and be able to talk to you. And quite honestly, it's intimidating. Because we know that you're going to ask the questions that are the hardest to answer and that need to be answered. But we appreciate it, and we would be delighted to stay around and chat for another half hour or so with anyone who has more questions. So I sincerely thank you for your time and interest in coming out tonight. Thank you.